My name is Brooke Mitchell. I'm 29 years old, and exactly 2 days after I gave birth, my mother-in-law locked me out of the family estate and held my newborn daughter hostage inside. A real mother wouldn't abandon her child to go hunt for pills. Catherine's voice crackled through the brass intercom, perfectly polished, as if stealing my baby was just a standard high society procedure. I looked up at the 98-degree heat radiating off the stone driveway. In the second-story window, my husband Trevor stood staring down at me. He didn't come down to open the door. He just reached out and slowly pulled the curtain shut. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from today, and tell me what would you do if someone locked you out of your own baby's nursery. I didn't pound my fists against the heavy oak doors. I didn't fall to my knees on the scorching concrete and beg them to let me back in. My pediatric nursing training kicked in, filtering the panic out of my bloodstream and replacing it with a quiet, terrifying focus. Catherine hadn't just snapped. She had purposely hidden my prescribed post-surgical pain medication that morning, feigning ignorance so I would have to drive to the pharmacy. A 10-minute errand. That was all it took for her to change the electronic locks. Standing in the suffocating Charleston heat, the last 8 months suddenly clicked into a horrifying alignment. I realized this was never a sudden coup. It was a slow, calculated takeover masked as aristocratic family tradition. Catherine had insisted on designing the nursery using my savings, calling it the honor of funding the Hayes legacy. But there wasn't a single photograph of me in that room. When she staged the 3-generation portraits, I was always placed just outside the frame, dismissed as being too swollen or too tired. She had normalized my exclusion so elegantly, wrapping her hostility in velvet ribbons of high society protocol, that I never saw the trap until the steel teeth snapped shut. She expected me to break. She wanted the hysterical, unhinged woman on her porch to validate the narrative she was already spinning inside. She wanted a screaming match. Instead, I turned my back to the mansion. I walked down the long driveway toward the front gates where a landscaping crew was trimming the hedges. My hands were shaking, but my voice was completely level when I asked the foreman to borrow his phone. I dialed the only number that mattered and typed out a text to my mother, Vanessa. It was a pre-arranged emergency code we had established when the red flags first started waving. Bring the blue blanket. My mother's silver sedan pulled up to the curb exactly 12 minutes later. I didn't look back at the mansion when I got in. I didn't need to. Sitting at my mother's small kitchen table, surrounded by the quiet, steady hum of the refrigerator, I shifted from a grieving mother into a clinical investigator. In pediatric nursing, when a patient crashes, you don't waste time crying over the monitors. You stabilize, you assess, and you document. I decided to treat my toxic family dynamic the exact same way. It wasn't a tragedy anymore. It was a critical diagnosis, and it was time to chart the symptoms, too. For the next 3 weeks, I became a ghost. My phone lit up constantly with frantic, gaslighting texts from Trevor. He accused me of abandoning our newborn, abandoning my duties, and threatened to call the authorities if I didn't come crawling back to apologize to his mother. I didn't reply to a single one. Emotion is just bad data in an investigation. I simply took screenshots and filed them into a digital folder. Instead of arguing, I opened my laptop. For 8 grueling months while I was pregnant, Catherine had forced me to provide round-the-clock, unpaid hospice care for Trevor's grandfather. She called it my duty to the prestigious Hayes name. What she didn't know was that my nursing license required me to keep a sterile, undeniable medical log. Every medication dose, every refused treatment, every skipped doctor's visit, I had meticulously recorded it all. I pulled up our joint bank statements. Trevor had convinced me to give him emergency access to my savings during my high-risk pregnancy, ultimately draining $75,000 for what Catherine claimed was specialized medical equipment for the grandfather. I placed the bank statements right next to my clinical logs. The truth was, hiding in plain sight. October 12th. $5,000 withdrawn for an oxygen compressor. My log showed the grandfather was breathing room air that entire week. November 3rd. $12,000 for in-home physical therapy. I traced the vendor identification numbers. They didn't belong to a clinic. They matched a premium floral company and a private event planner for Catherine's country club galas. December 9th, $20,000 for a private nursing consultant. The routing number belonged to a high-end caterer. They hadn't bought oxygen tanks or hired specialists. They had bought centerpieces and champagne. I didn't just have a cowardly husband and a cruel mother-in-law. I had two people actively committing elder abuse and financial fraud. And page by page, I began assembling a very thick, very quiet binder. If you surrender quietly, Brooke, we might allow supervised visits on holidays. Catherine left that voicemail on a Tuesday afternoon. Her tone was light and breezy, almost conversational. She sounded exactly like she was offering me a second-tier country club membership instead of crumbs of my own daughter's life. She assumed I was paralyzed by postpartum fear, sobbing into a pillow in my childhood bedroom. She didn't know I was sitting at a kitchen table, methodically building a timeline of her crimes. The Hayes family didn't just want my child. They wanted to dismantle my capacity to fight back. 2 days later, an anonymous complaint was filed with the state nursing board. It accused me of stealing patient medication and exhibiting aggressively unstable behavior. It was designed to freeze my license, terminate my employment, and bankrupt me. The very next morning, a courier handed my mother a thick stack of family court documents. Catherine had officially filed for emergency full custody. The centerpiece of her lawsuit was a 3-page psychiatric evaluation. It legally labeled me a severe danger to my infant, claiming I had suffered a complete, violent psychological break. I didn't scream when I read the accusations. I poured a cup of black coffee and reviewed the pages exactly the way I review a critical patient's chart. Catherine's lifelong arrogance had finally made her fatally sloppy. She genuinely believed that, because her last name was Hayes, nobody would ever dare to double-check her paperwork. I stared at the clinic logo printed at the top of the evaluation. It was a perfectly crisp letterhead from the Brightway Psychiatric Institute. The only problem was, Brightway had retired that specific logo 4 years ago. I knew that for a fact, because my hospital handled their pediatric overflows, and I had personally watched their administrative staff throw out boxes of that exact old letterhead. I scanned down to the bottom of the page to check the signature. Dr. Alan Vance. I opened my laptop and pulled up the National Medical Conference schedules for that exact date. Dr. Vance wasn't in Charleston signing emergency psychiatric evaluations. He was giving a keynote address on adolescent trauma in Columbus, Ohio. Catherine thought she was burying a terrified, helpless girl under an avalanche of elite legal threats. She didn't realize she had just handed irrefutable proof of federal forgery to a nurse who charted vital details for a living. I closed the manila folder. I walked into the bedroom and took my dark gray suit out of the closet. It was time for court. The Charleston family court was a tomb of frosted glass and sterile air conditioning, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the driveway where I was locked out weeks ago. Catherine and Trevor sat at the petitioner's table, looking like a magazine spread for Southern aristocracy. Catherine wore vintage pearls. Trevor wore a tailored navy suit and the manufactured expression of a deeply heartbroken father. Their lawyer stood up and immediately directed the court's attention to the monitors. He played the edited video. There I was, exhausted, my face red, screaming, "I don't want to see anyone in this house anymore." The audio echoed off the heavy wood paneling. The judge frowned, his pen pausing over his legal pad. Trevor looked across the aisle at me, shaking his head with practiced, sorrowful pity. I didn't flinch. Panic is useless in a triage unit, and it is just as useless in a courtroom. My lawyer calmly stood up. Your Honor, we would like to enter the unedited security footage into evidence. The monitors flickered. The exact same scene played. But this time, it started 30 seconds earlier. The courtroom speakers amplified Catherine's sharp, venomous whisper as she leaned closely into my ear. You will never be alone with this baby. Then came my scream. The judge's pen slowly lowered to his desk. The heavy silence in the room was deafening. I was called to take the stand. I didn't shed a single tear. I simply sat down and opened my heavy medical binder. October 12th, I stated, my voice completely level. $5,000 withdrawn by Trevor Hayes for a prescribed oxygen compressor. Patient vitals on that date show room air breathing. The vendor routing number belongs to a premium floral company. I slowly turned the page, the crisp paper slicing through the quiet room. November 3rd, $12,000 for in-home physical therapy. The vendor identification matches a country club event planner. I looked directly at Catherine. Her aristocratic mask was fracturing. The arrogant smirk had melted into raw, flushed panic. She was sweating in a 68-degree room. The $75,000 wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was documented elder abuse, and I was reading every single receipt into the official record. Catherine slammed her hands on the petitioner's table, her vintage pearls shaking against her collarbone. He was losing his mind, she cried out, interrupting the court proceedings. He gave me that money willingly, and she... Catherine pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at me. Is a delusional liar. Look at the psychiatric evaluation. She belongs in a locked ward, not alone with a child. She expected me to break. She desperately wanted a hysterical, emotional reaction to validate her fabricated narrative. I didn't raise my voice. I maintained complete calm, knowing this false counterattack would shatter immediately against undeniable paperwork. I simply slid her psychiatric evaluation across the polished mahogany table toward the judge. Your Honor, I said, the microphone catching the cold, steady rhythm of my voice. The clinic logo at the top of that evaluation belongs to Brightway Psychiatric. However, they retired that specific letterhead 4 years ago. Furthermore, Dr. Alan Vance, whose signature appears at the bottom of page 3, was delivering a medical keynote address in Columbus, Ohio, on the exact date he supposedly evaluated me here in Charleston. I pulled out one final piece of paper, avoiding any complex forensic jargon and relying strictly on everyday, irrefutable facts. And regarding the grandfather's mental capacity, I have a sworn affidavit from his attending hospice physician confirming he was entirely lucid. Time slowed to an absolute crawl. I watched Catherine's high-priced attorney lean over, examine the Ohio conference schedule I had submitted, and then look back at his client. He didn't argue. He slowly closed his leather briefcase, clicked the brass locks shut, and took a physical step away from her. Her entire defense collapsed instantly under the weight of the truth. Suffocating in the dead silence of the courtroom, facing immediate federal perjury and fraud charges, Catherine turned her panicked eyes to her golden child. She waited for Trevor to jump on the grenade. She waited for him to take the blame. Trevor stood up. He looked at the judge, then at the police officer by the door, and finally at his mother. He physically backed away. My mother told me everything was legal, he whispered. The fallout didn't take years. It took exactly 48 hours. Catherine was arrested right in the hallway outside the courtroom. The charges were federal perjury, financial fraud, and elder abuse. I didn't stay to watch the police put the handcuffs on her wrists. I didn't need to. Trevor ambushed me 2 days later outside my mother's house. He was out on bail, looking frantic and entirely stripped of his tailored suits and his manufactured arrogance. He stood on the sidewalk and begged for forgiveness. He swore he was manipulated, claiming that Catherine had controlled him his whole life and that he just wanted his family back. I watched him stand there, a grown man who had traded his wife and newborn child for a comfortable bedroom in a decaying mansion. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I just pulled out my phone, opened my audio files, and pressed play. His own voice filled the quiet street. "I just need you to make sure I don't lose the house." The recording stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. He had nothing left to say, and I had nothing left to give. I turned my back, walked inside, and locked the door. Without my savings to float their extravagant lifestyle, the bank foreclosed on the Hayes mansion 3 weeks later. The heavy oak doors were chained shut for good. The seasons finally turned. It is autumn now. The blistering heat of that afternoon on the driveway is entirely gone. I am sitting in the sunlit backyard of a small, warm home I share with my mother. My daughter is sleeping peacefully against my chest, breathing in the crisp air. My nursing license was cleared completely. The hospital administration reviewed Catherine's anonymous complaint and dismissed it. They didn't just reinstate me. They promoted me to a lead pediatric coordinator. The grandfather passed away peacefully in a proper medical facility a few weeks later. He didn't leave me a massive trust fund. He left a final recorded statement for the court, thanking me for keeping him comfortable when his own blood treated him like a burden. That was the only inheritance I ever wanted from them. There are no more sterile medical logs to keep. There are no toxic whispers echoing down long hallways, and no fake aristocratic titles to uphold. The Hayes legacy was an illusion built on stolen money. I built my family on the truth, and the truth is incredibly peaceful. Sometimes, the only way to protect your future is to completely walk away from the people who demand you set yourself on fire to keep them warm. Drop the number 100 in the comments if you would have handed over those forged documents too, and subscribe for more stories of ultimate karma. 5 years have passed since the bank padlocked the heavy oak doors of the Hayes mansion. The local Charleston papers ran the story of Catherine's sentencing for 3 weeks straight. But I stopped reading after the first day. I didn't need the media to validate the truth I had already charted. Trevor never fought for custody. Once his mother was transferred to a federal facility and the grand inheritance officially vanished, he relocated to another state, quietly fading into the background of a life he could no longer afford. He sends a generic, store-bought birthday card once a year. I drop them in a cardboard box in the attic. My daughter can read them when she's old enough to understand that some people are only capable of loving what you can do for them, not who you are. Yesterday, a letter arrived in our mailbox with a state penitentiary return address. Catherine's once elegant, sweeping handwriting had turned jagged and desperate across the envelope. I didn't open it. I didn't need to read her fabricated apologies or her manipulative pleas for a supervised visit. I simply walked over to the home office, dropped the unopened envelope into the paper shredder, and listened to the satisfying, mechanical hum of the steel blades. Emotion is just bad data, and I was done collecting hers. I stepped out into our backyard. My mother, Vanessa, was pushing my daughter on the wooden swing we built together. The autumn air was crisp and entirely clear. There are no illusions here, no fake aristocratic titles to uphold, and no secret ledgers to balance. We built this home on solid ground and undeniable facts. And as I watched my daughter laugh, wrapped tightly in her favorite blue blanket, I knew we had secured the only legacy that actually matters: